How can we learn from the past?
It is a story that Americans are challenged with all the time.
It's haunting, cruel,
Tragic,
threatening, shocking,
unbelievable,
evil,
illogical,
xenophobic,
genocidal,
danger, death. But that's not all there is to this story.
I think it was for many, many years a beckoning subject, something we had to deal with, something we had to confront as filmmakers of American history.
This is a story in which everyone is challenged all the time. We are challenged as Americans, we're challenged as parents, as children, to think about what we would have done, what we could have done, what we should have done. Even though the Holocaust physically took place in Europe, it is a story that Americans have to reckon with too.
Why would we want to go back and look at this dark, dark time? But the opportunity to look at it through the perspective of what does it mean for America and Americans was an opportunity we just couldn't pass up.
Part of our national mythology is that we are a good people. We are a democracy. And we are a democracy. And in our better moments, we are very good people. But that's not all there is to this story.
We have interviews from scholars and writers who have studied the story, but there's just really nothing like speaking to someone who lived through it and hearing their story directly told to you.
My father explained, if we're in two different places, the chance that two of us will survive is bigger. So that was the first time that I really realized it's a matter of life and death.
These are important events in American history that need to be understood now and 5 years from now. Every generation deserves to look at the defining moments of the human experience and try to understand them for the present.
This story is beyond our comprehension. It's horrifying. I won't work on a more important film in my professional life.
How can we learn from the past?
It is a story that Americans are challenged with all the time.
It's haunting, cruel,
Tragic.
Threatening, shocking,
unbelievable,
Evil.
illogical,
xenophobic,
genocide,
danger, death. But that's not all there is to this story.
Hello, I'm Cynthia Hunt with the Amarillo Public Library. The film clips you have just been seeing were taken from the new Ken Burns documentary, The U.S. and the Holocaust, and I've been asked to say a few words about the documentary on behalf of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum is honored that the Americans and the Holocaust exhibition inspired Ken Burns, Lynn Novick, and Sarah Botstein to produce a new documentary, The U.S. and the Holocaust. The film was produced solely by Florentine Films. Like the Americans and the Holocaust exhibition, the film explored what Americans knew about the persecution and murder of the Jews and how they responded to it. It will make an important contribution to our understanding of both Holocaust and American history. The museum was pleased to cooperate with the filmmakers by providing archival and historical sources and expertise in support of the film. Now, on to some book housekeeping. We are recording today's presentation for use later on the library's YouTube channel. So we ask that at this time you please turn the volume on your phones all the way down, and better yet, turn them off completely during the event. If you get a call you simply must take, please answer with the words "Hold please" spoken in a low volume, then leave the room and get away from the doors before beginning your conversation. This will not only make the recording more enjoyable for viewers in the future, but also be less distracting for both the audience and the presenter in the present. Now, on to the Amarillo Public Library's lecture series, Modern Perspectives on the Holocaust. Each of the presentations in this series has been carefully chosen by the library and then vetted by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and are designed to enhance and deepen your understanding of one or more themes contained within the Americans and the Holocaust traveling exhibition, which we are currently hosting at our downtown library. This series has been made possible in part by the Friends of the Amarillo Public Library, the Amarillo Civic Center Complex, Panhandle PBS, the American Library Association, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and Education Credit Union. Today's presentation, Ordinary People, Extraordinary Actions, The Rescue Mission of Mr. and Mrs. Kraus, is being presented by Steven Pressman, the author of 50 Children, One Ordinary American Couple's Extraordinary Rescue Mission into the Heart of Nazi Germany. He is also the writer, director, and producer of the Emmy-nominated 50 Children, The Rescue Mission of Mr. and Mrs. Kraus, which premiered on HBO in 2013. There is additional information on your programs about Mr. Pressman. We chose this as one of our programs because Gilbert and Eleanor Kraus are featured in the Did Americans Help the Refugees section of the exhibition. So, without further ado, I give you Steven Pressman.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. It's a real pleasure to be in Amarillo. This is the second time I've been in Amarillo. The first time was about 55 years ago. My mother and father and my older brother and older sister were taking a cross-country car trip from Los Angeles, where I grew up, to New York City, where my father had grown up and had not been back to since he left as a child. My brother was 17 years old at the time, and you can probably imagine how happy he was to be sitting in the back seat with his younger brother and his younger sister. But we did stop in Amarillo, and in fact, we probably traced the route of old Route 66, which I know runs right through town, which I made a point of driving when I was driving over here from my hotel earlier today. So long story short, it's a real pleasure to be back in Amarillo, even if my brother and my sister can't be here to join me. Cynthia mentioned my book and my film that I'm talking about today. A quick word about that. I did things sort of backwards. Often films are based on books, and even though I was a print journalist for 30-some-odd years before I turned to filmmaking, I actually made my 50 Children documentary film first. So in a sense, the book that Cynthia mentioned, which goes into considerably more detail about this story that I'm going to talk about today, turned out to be a book based on a film rather than a film based on a book. But in any event, it's a real pleasure to be here to talk to you for a few minutes about what is really a quite remarkable and a story that was basically hidden for reasons that I'll also talk about in a few minutes. A story that was hidden for many years before I had a chance to delve into it. I've got the advantage of being able to provide some photographs and documents, as well as a few short, brief film clips from my documentary film that Cynthia had mentioned, which again premiered on HBO a few years back. So it's nice to be able to show some clips from the film, which also help to, I think, illustrate the story that I'm here to talk about today. So let me jump right in. For many years, my wife, Liz, kept a stack of yellowing onion skin pages tucked away, half forgotten really, in a desk drawer in her home in San Francisco. Mixed in with the usual mundane assortment of very exciting things like our bank statements and our kids' medical records, other very equally exciting household documents. But let me assure you, there was nothing mundane at all about the astonishing tale that had been carefully typed out on those brittle pages decades earlier. And in fact, the contents of a plastic bag that was wedged between the manila file folders in that same desk drawer added even more drama to that stack of old fading pages. Because inside that plastic bag, as you see on the screen, were more than a dozen German passports, each one stamped with a menacing Nazi swastika, and each of those documents bearing the name and photograph of a young girl or boy. Well, the broad outline of what Gil and Eleanor Kraus, who, by the way, Gil and Eleanor Kraus were my wife's maternal grandparents. The broad outline of what the Krauses did in the spring of 1939 was not exactly a secret. What I mean by that is family members in my wife's family had long been aware, at least of the broad outlines of this couple's very daring voyage into Nazi Germany on the eve of the Holocaust and their return to the United States with 50 Jewish children in their care. But for the rest of their lives, however, neither Gil nor Eleanor Kraus spoke in any detail, either with family or friends or anyone else, about their very improbable actions in the spring of 1939. And they certainly offered no clues that explain how, more importantly, why this couple, a Jewish couple from Philadelphia, found themselves face to face with Gestapo officers, menacing stormtroopers in Nazi-controlled Vienna, Austria, where they were determined to rescue children whose lives by the spring of 1939, were increasingly at risk. At some point, however, Eleanor had typed out a very detailed account of a far-fetched rescue plan that had begun with a simple discussion between her husband, Gil, and a friend of his, a gentleman named Louis Levine, who at the time, and again, this is in the early months of 1939, Mr. Levine was the head of a national Jewish fraternal organization called Brit Shalom. Well, I have to tell you, when I first looked at Eleanor's typewritten pages on those old fading onion skin pages that I mentioned a moment ago, what she wrote on those pages read, to me at least, like an improbable, if not an impossible product of a vivid imagination. I remember thinking, is this a novel I'm reading? It just did not sound like something that might have actually happened. And yet, incredibly, as I discovered, the bold rescue mission that Eleanor described in those pages had taken place precisely as she had written. Well, I first learned of Eleanor's private manuscript not long after Liz, my wife, and I met over 20 years ago in San Francisco. This was the summer of 2000. And I have to admit that it then took me another several years, about a decade really, before I was able to really devote my full attention and to dig more deeply into this fascinating episode that for years had remained hidden in plain sight, or I suppose I should say hidden in that file drawer at our home in San Francisco. And once I focused on the words on those pages, it quickly became very clear to me that this was a lot more than simply another Holocaust rescue account. And as I did additional research into Gil and Eleanor's unheralded actions, all of it led me, at least, to a much greater understanding of the considerable obstacles that stood in the Krauses' way as they valiantly carried out their mission. The Krauses embarked on their journey, on this mission, during a very brief window of time when the Nazis in Germany were carrying out a policy known in German as Judenrein. This was a determined and a highly systematic effort to rid Germany and Austria, which by this time had become part of Nazi Germany, to get rid of all of the Jews who lived in those countries simply by pressuring them to go elsewhere. Less than a year before Gil and Eleanor traveled to Vienna, so we're talking about 1938, Adolf Eichmann had arrived in Vienna to oversee something called the Central Bureau for Jewish Emigration, which had been designed as a brutally efficient operation with really an almost assembly line precision aimed at expediting the removal of every Jew who lived in Vienna. As one of Eichmann's SS officers later described, a Jew would pass through this entire building, from counter to counter, from office to office. He would come out the other end. He would have no money. He would have no rights. All he would have is a passport on which it is written, "You must leave this country within 2 weeks. And if you fail to do so, we will send you to a concentration camp." Well, Adolf Eichmann himself had moved on from Vienna to Prague by the time Gil and Eleanor themselves set foot inside this building that you see on the screen. This is the ornate Rothschild Palace that the Nazis had confiscated from the very well-known European Jewish banking company that the Nazis had confiscated before Eichmann had converted it to use as the Central Immigration Bureau. And it was inside that building, that very ornate building, where the Krauses ultimately obtained the German passports that were needed before they could take 50 Jewish children with them from Vienna to the United States. I think one of the most powerful moments for me, both in the film I made about this episode and the book I subsequently wrote, occurs in the form of a very poignant reminder and something that is often forgotten about when we consider the Holocaust. And that would be the possibility, at this period in time, the possibility of saving so many more lives during this period. And I'm going to show you a very, very brief clip from my film. And in this clip, one of the rescued children, a lovely woman who lived for decades after in New York City named Henny Winkart, Henny reminds us of what might have happened differently back then.
In Vienna, it wasn't the case that some people were wondering whether or not to leave. Whoever could leave did. My pediatrician left by jumping out the window and killing himself. What people don't understand is at the beginning, you could get out. Everybody could get out. Nobody would let us in. Everyone could have been saved. Everyone.
Well, the more I dug into this remarkable story, the more I realized I had an opportunity to explore the much broader social, cultural, political context in which this rescue project took place. But not only in Nazi Germany. And in fact, the more I immersed myself in this story, the more I realized that I was also telling a story about us as Americans, what was happening here at home in the United States. And what I learned during the course of both the film and then the book turned out to me to be both eye-opening and unfortunately very, very disturbing. It's not exactly headline news, I think, to most of us, that the ugly stains of anti-Semitism could be found throughout American society during this period, the 1930s. But I never imagined just how deeply embedded those stains of anti-Semitism really were. There were a series of public opinion polls that were conducted throughout the decade of the 1930s. The science of taking public opinion polls was just being developed, actually, by organizations like the Roper Organization and the Gallup Organization, names that we have come to associate with public opinion polling all these decades later. And indeed, there were a series of these polls conducted throughout the 1930s that revealed the deep and widespread negative attitudes toward Jews, towards American Jews, held by the American public. For example, one of the polls found that 60% of Americans held a low opinion of Jews, regarding them as greedy, dishonest, pushy. More than 40% believed that Jews held too much power in the United States. That figure would eventually rise to 58% by the end of the war in 1945. There was a poll, again, by the Roper Organization in 1939, the same year of the Kraus rescue mission, which revealed that fewer than 40% of Americans felt that Jews should receive the same treatment as all other citizens. And more than half, 53%, agreed with the statement that, quote, Jews are different and should be restricted. And perhaps the most alarming of all these public opinion poll results during this period, 1 out of every 10 Americans felt that all Jews, citizens of the United States, should simply be deported outright from America. you know, when I came across that statistic, I thought, well, gee, maybe we should take some comfort thinking that 90% of Americans apparently felt otherwise. But I have to tell you that even that 10% figure, 1 in 10, to me was shockingly disturbing. Well, it's not too difficult, I suppose, to understand why there was so much anti-Semitism in this country during the 1930s, when we had figures like Father Charles Coughlin, the so-called radio priest, who had gained enormous popularity with his weekly radio broadcasts and speeches like this that he was giving around the country.
We are Christian insofar as we believe in Christ's principle of love your neighbor as yourself, and with that principle, I challenge every Jew in this nation to tell me that he does not believe in it.
Well, the story of the Krauses also overlaps with somebody else, another very familiar figure to most of us, who all these years later continues, quite candidly, to be something of a lightning rod figure when it comes to this ongoing debate over what the United States could have or should have done differently when it came to saving Jewish lives throughout the years of the Third Reich and as the Holocaust was developing.
President Roosevelt was a hero to the Jews of his day. When Jews looked around the world and they saw Hitler and they saw Stalin and they saw Mussolini, they felt mighty glad that the man who was running the United States was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Nevertheless, he was a consummate politician, and there were things that he felt deeply about, and he made sure they happened. Arming America secretly was one of them. Helping Britain was one of them. Saving Jews was not one of them.
Well, let's get back to Gil and Eleanor, the reason I'm here today. The more I dug into this nearly lost to history episode, the more I kept asking myself one question: why? What was it about this couple? They were two very, very assimilated, non-religious Jews. In fact, they sent their own 2 young children to Quaker schools in Philadelphia. They had little, if anything, to do with the city's organized Jewish community, which was quite significant in Philadelphia during this period. What was it that led them to undertake and ultimately carry out their rescue mission? The answer, well, at least part of the answer, was a little easier to discover when it came to Gil Kraus. Gil's father was a guy named Solomon Kraus. Solomon himself was born in Philadelphia in the 1860s. He was the son of German Jewish immigrants who had been part of that great migration of German Jews and others who had come to this country, who had come to the U.S. way back in the 1840s to escape from the turmoil of revolution that was rocking throughout Europe during that time. Saul Kraus had made a name for himself both in Philadelphia's business and in political circles. I found out something that even members of the Kraus family today had not known about. Saul Kraus, their ancestor, had cast an electoral vote for Grover Cleveland in the 1892 presidential election, and Saul himself even entertained thoughts of a political career. I found out that at one point he stood for election to a municipal judgeship in Philadelphia. Never mind for a moment the fact that Saul was not a lawyer. But I'm pretty sure he gave up on the idea of elective office when he came in about 7th in a field of no more than 6 candidates. And instead, Saul focused on becoming a relatively successful real estate guy in Philadelphia. More importantly, for purposes of our story today, Saul was also part of a Jewish community that took very seriously something that is known in the Jewish faith as tikkun olam. Those are Hebrew words that mean to save the world. It's an ancient sort of imperative that Jews have often carried with them, this notion of doing things to help save the world around them. Well, like his father, Gil, as I mentioned a little earlier, was hardly a religious Jew, but instead he was part of what we might think of as a kind of Philadelphia branch of the Our Crowd contingent. And by that I mean socially, culturally prominent Jews, most of whom, virtually all of whom, were originally from Germany. Folks who were fairly intellectual, sophisticated, cultured, and often, and most importantly, very civic and philanthropically minded when it came to helping others. Gil, in the 1930s, was a business lawyer in Philadelphia, and following in his father's footsteps, was also very active in that Brit Shalom organization that I mentioned, that fraternal organization that indeed his father Saul had helped to start in Philadelphia way, way back in 1905. And so it was that at the beginning of 1939, Gil Kraus is now in his early 40s. He meets with his friend, Louis Levine, who you see on the screen next to Gil. And Mr. Levine had come to Gil Kraus with a request that he take on this seemingly impossible task, planning and carrying out the rescue of 50 Jewish children from Nazi Germany. Well, let's go back to Eleanor. She's a very different kettle of fish in all this. She was a woman who very much epitomized both her time and her social setting. Unlike her husband Gil, Eleanor descended from Eastern European Jewish stock, part of that migration that had come to this country several decades or a few decades after the German Jews came in the 1840s and 1850s. These were the Eastern Europeans who started coming over in droves in the 1880s through the early part of the 20th century. And without a doubt, and at the risk of sounding just slightly sexist, I think it's fair to say that Eleanor Kraus moved up in the social standings when she and Gil got married in 1924. Eleanor was a woman who favored stylish clothes, fine jewelry. She loved fancy hats. She loved to host dinner parties, spending evenings out at the symphony. There was a long-time rumor that I ran across when I was doing my research. I have to admit, a rumor that was never confirmed by anyone, as best as I can tell, but a delicious rumor nonetheless, that Eleanor at some point in her young life had had something of a fling with Leopold Stokowski, the longtime conductor of the Philadelphia Orchestra. I did my best to run this rumor down, and there was a distant connection through somebody who Eleanor was related to by marriage, who worked very closely with Stokowski. So there was a little bit of smoke there, if indeed there was not definitely a fire. But whether or not that rumor was true, it is very accurate to describe Eleanor as somebody who was very happy being the wife of a successful lawyer from a fairly prominent family. Life was pretty good for her. And so you could probably imagine her reaction when her husband comes home one cold night in January of 1939, takes Eleanor aside shortly before they're about to host a dinner party at their home with some friends, and mentions this idea of going to Nazi Germany in order to bring back a group of Jewish children.
Gil told me that his friend Louis Levine had come to see him that day at Gil's law office. They had talked for hours about an idea to bring Jewish children out of Nazi Germany and into the United States. This is really crazy, I told Gil. No one in his right mind would go into Germany now. It's not safe, especially for Jews. I'm not sure you could get in, and I doubt you could stand it for even 24 hours. I'd be too scared to put a foot into that country, assuming the stormtroopers would even let me in.
Well, I'm going to cut to the chase. Several weeks later, Gil sailed to Europe on the Queen Mary. He sailed in a first-class cabin, befitting his status. Initially, Eleanor Kraus stayed behind. She remained in Philadelphia briefly because she had been warned by a State Department official in Washington. I had no idea until I was doing the research for this project that back then, you would go to the State Department in Washington to pick up your passport. And Gil and Eleanor had taken a train ride from Philadelphia to Washington, D.C. For those passports. It was perfectly legal, by the way, for Americans to be traveling to Nazi Germany. This was still before the war had started, and more importantly, certainly before the U.S. was involved in any kind of military conflict with Nazi Germany. It might have been a little risky, but there was nothing legally to prevent American citizens from traveling to Germany. Nonetheless, a State Department official pulled Eleanor aside and said that, in his opinion, Nazi Germany was simply not quite the place for an American woman, Jewish or otherwise, to be traveling. Well, instead, Gil was accompanied on the Queen Mary by a friend of the Krauses, Dr. Robert Schless. He was a very prominent, very well-known Philadelphia pediatrician. He was a friend of the Krauses. Dr. Schless also happened to speak fluent German, and he quickly agreed to help with the rescue mission. Like the Krauses, Dr. Schless had young children at home. He had 3 boys. He was a widower with 3 young sons, but to his credit, that did not stop him from instantly agreeing to accompany Gil to Europe when they sailed on the Queen Mary in April of 1939. Well, as it turned out, Eleanor herself courageously joined her husband and Dr. Schless in Vienna just a few weeks later. Gil sent her a cable. He told her time was running out. There was so much work for them to do if they had any hope at all of succeeding in their rescue mission. And Gil decided that he needed Eleanor to be there to help him and Dr. Kraus. And so she went. She packed some of her jewelry, she took some of her hats, and she sailed into the heart of Nazi Germany.
On the train from Paris to Vienna, we stopped briefly at Linz. We decided to stretch our legs and walked out onto the platform. The loudspeakers were blaring. Hitler was making a speech. He screamed every word. This was Hitler's birthplace and my introduction to Nazi Germany.
The 50 children that Gil and Eleanor Kraus brought back to the United States in June of 1939 wound up being the single largest group of so-called unaccompanied children, that is, children who were sent off without their parents, who were allowed into our country during the entirety of the Holocaust. There were only a total of about 1,000 or so of these unaccompanied children who were allowed to enter the United States. That's a very sad and a very depressing number, particularly when we compare it to the 10,000 Jewish children who were sent off to England during 1938 and 1939 in what became known as the Kindertransport. 50, the largest single group of children. Not even a drop in the bucket, and especially when you consider that 1.5 million children perished in the Holocaust. Over the last number of years since I've told this story in my film and my book, I've sometimes had the honor of participating in programs like this with a gentleman named Paul Shapiro. Paul is the former director of the Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, the same institution, of course, that is co-sponsoring the traveling exhibition along with the American Library Association. And when Paul, who has devoted his decades, years of professional life researching the Holocaust, when he talks about Gil and Eleanor's heroic mission, he does a wonderful job of discussing their story within the context of a number of enduring myths that often surround the Holocaust to this day. For instance, there is the myth that just about everyone in France, after France fell to the Nazis, was a passionate member of the resistance, the resistance, when the facts and the sheer numbers prove otherwise. There is another myth that in Holland, everyone was eager to hide thousands of Anne Franks in their attics, when the facts, unfortunately and sadly, prove otherwise. And in the United States, there is the myth that people perhaps would have been willing to do a lot more to help save the Jews of Europe if only they had known, if only we had known earlier what Adolf Hitler was really up to. Well, as Paul likes to point out, neither Gil nor Eleanor Kraus were members of the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, the agency that later evolved into the CIA. In other words, they weren't spies. They weren't intelligence agents. They didn't have access to private cables or secret information about what the Nazis were doing in Germany throughout the 1930s. Instead, they were simply two relatively ordinary American citizens who were reading the newspapers, which were filled with stories about the increasingly brutal measures directed against Jews. Both before and after an episode in November of 1938 that became known as Kristallnacht, the so-called Night of Shattered Glass, Americans, assuming they had interest in informing themselves, had every opportunity to learn what was happening to the hundreds of thousands of Jews living in Germany and Austria. Now, I want to be very sure about something. We're talking about a period in time prior, well before the worst horrors of the Holocaust, the death camps, the horrors of the final solution, the horrors of Auschwitz were still a couple of years off. But the signs were there. And by the late 1930s, it was already a race against time to save the Jews of Europe. And so perhaps the question that I described earlier isn't why Gil and Eleanor Kraus did what they did to save the lives of 50 children. And perhaps the more important question, and I think that one that continues to haunt a lot of us to this day, is why there weren't hundreds or even thousands of Gil and Eleanor Krauses who were willing to do the same thing. Now, to be fair and accurate, there were plenty of other individuals and groups, Jewish, non-Jewish, all kinds of groups, who worked tirelessly to bring Jewish refugees into the United States. And for the most part, they all ran up against the very same obstacles that Gil encountered, very, very rigid American immigration laws that made it difficult, really impossible, to bring in large numbers. And Gil, to his everlasting credit, figured out a way to bring in these 50 children in full legal compliance with the immigration laws. These were not children who were somehow sneaked into the United States. And again, there were others who also acted very bravely during this time. But were there hundreds of them? Were there thousands of them? That phrase I used a few moments ago, the Hebrew phrase tikkun olam, to repair the world, sadly it seems had its limits precisely at this dark time in history when the need to repair the world should have had no bounds. At precisely the same time when the Krauses were carrying out their small rescue mission, the Congress in Washington, D.C. was debating a bill. It was known as the Wagner-Rogers Bill. That piece of legislation would have allowed as many as 20,000 children, primarily Jewish, to come to the United States above and beyond the existing quota that was in place during that time. The bill was sponsored by two members of Congress, Edith Norris Rogers. She was a member of the House of Representatives. She was a Republican from Massachusetts. And in the Senate, the bill was sponsored by Democratic New York Senator Robert Wagner. One of the most impassioned advocates for the Wagner-Rogers bill was a then young actress. Some of you might recognize Helen Hayes, who, by the way, was wearing a hat that Eleanor Kraus would have killed for. Helen Hayes showed up in Washington, D.C. to testify in behalf of the Wagner-Rogers bill. She appeared before a congressional committee that was considering the bill. I know it must be difficult to visualize the anguish, she said, that mothers in Germany must feel to make them, the parents, willing and eager to give up their children and send them to a strange land. But, she said, that is the most potent evidence of the immediate need of those children. You know, I would often think of Helen Hayes' very eloquent, very stirring words, and continue to think of those words long after I worked on this project, because I realized that the words that she spoke before Congress way back in 1939 could just have easily been uttered today. I think a lot of us have been immersed in a lot of heartbreaking stories about a swelling tide of refugees from around the world, children and adults alike, most recently streaming into Europe, a little less in our country, streaming into Europe from places like Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan, and now, of course, from Ukraine. And a few years ago, there was even a more striking parallel, I think, to the 50 children story that could be found with, for a period of time, tens of thousands of children from Central America, from Honduras, from El Salvador, from Guatemala, who very much like the unaccompanied children from Nazi Germany in the 1930s, had parents who were desperate to find safe haven for their children. I don't understand parents, one woman said. I don't understand parents sending their child away no matter what the conditions are back home. This was a woman in Arizona who wasn't so keen on the idea of allowing children into this country from Central America. They should be home with their parents, she said. Well, when I read those words a few years back, they sounded very similar to something I had run across before. And I went back into my notes from when I was working on this project, and I found a quote from this gentleman on the screen. This is Senator Robert Reynolds. He was a Democratic senator from the great state of North Carolina who happened to be rabidly anti-immigrant, and he led the campaign against enactment of the Wagner-Rogers bill, the bill that would have allowed thousands of children into this country. He would give occasional radio broadcasts on this issue. And in one of those broadcasts, he said, "Shall we first take care of our own children, or shall we bestow our charity on children imported from abroad? Well, unfortunately, those kinds of hints of anti-Semitism surfaced again and again during the debate over the Wagner-Rogers bill. Indeed, a cousin of our president, a cousin of Franklin Roosevelt, Laura Delano Hoteling, she was the wife of the U.S. Commissioner of Immigration at the time, and FDR's cousin. She was very much against the Wagner-Rogers bill, and she once described it this way. She said, if a bill like this were to pass, 20,000 charming children would all too soon grow up to become 20,000 ugly adults. At precisely the same moment that the Krauses were sailing back to New York with the 50 children from Vienna, one of the great ironies, President Roosevelt all but sealed the fate of the Wagner-Rogers bill by declining to support the legislation, which, by the way, had been strongly championed by his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt. And in the end, the Wagner-Rogers bill never even came up for a vote on the floor of either the House or the Senate. When I was thinking of what to call my film, now in retrospect, 50 Children seems like a pretty logical choice, but I originally was going to call it To Save a Life. And the reason for that is Gil and Eleanor's courageous mission always reminded me very powerfully and very poignantly of an ancient passage from what's known in the Jewish faith as the Talmud, a collection of gathered centuries ago. Basically, it's a collection of commentaries from rabbis from centuries and centuries ago talking about various tenets of the Jewish faith. And there is a passage in the Talmud that says, whoever saves a single life, it is as if that person has saved the entire world. Now, Gil, he was not a scholar, he was not a Jewish scholar whatsoever, but he knew enough to allude to that very idea in a speech that he delivered to members of his own organization, that Brit Shalom organization, only a week or so after he and Eleanor had returned from Europe with the children from Vienna. The number 50, Gil said, is but a small drop among the hundreds of thousands of lives yet to be saved. Each life is worth a world unto itself, and each child shall be privileged to live and breathe in a land, the United States of America, consecrated to freedom and liberty. Well, that message remains as profound and relevant today as it was against the backdrop of Nazi Germany, against the ugliness of anti-Semitism in the United States throughout the 1930s. I think that all of us, each and every one of us, ultimately, in the final analysis, possesses the capacity to save the world, one life at a time, one righteous act at a time, even one tiny small deed at a time, no matter how seemingly insignificant it is. And all these years later, more than 80 years have now passed since Gil and Eleanor Kraus carried out their rescue mission of the 50 children. All these years later, I think of Gil and Eleanor Kraus as two relatively ordinary Americans, and I'm absolutely sure that they themselves never set out to be heroes when they embarked upon their unlikely rescue plan. And in fact, as their granddaughter Liz mentioned at the very end of my film, they did remain very much in character throughout this rescue mission.
I don't want to paint my grandparents as saints. They went to Nazi Germany and Austria But they stayed in luxury hotels and they ate in fine restaurants. I honestly think it wouldn't have occurred to them to do it any other way. What they did was very selfless, even if my grandmother did it with a really nice hat.
And so perhaps in the final analysis, that is precisely what makes the extraordinary accomplishment of the Krauses and what turned out to be their truly historic contribution to, once again, tikkun olam, repairing the world and healing the world, all the more heroic. And with that, I want to thank you, and I want to see if there are any folks who might have some questions. Cynthia has a microphone because we're not exactly in a very intimate setting here. And I'd love to be able to answer any questions that anybody might have about this story.
How were the 50 children selected, and were they returned on a plane or a ship?
Great. I assume everybody heard the question. How were the children selected? You know, that was one of the toughest things that the Krauses, along with Dr. Schless, had to face when they were in Vienna for a number of weeks in the spring of 1939. Word had very quickly gotten out among Jewish families in Vienna. Vienna, by the way, at this time in history, this is the late 1930s, had a population of about 180,000 Jews. It was one of the larger Jewish populations in Western Europe. And needless to say, there were thousands upon thousands of young children. Gil knew he only had the opportunity to grab 50 of these visas for these children to come into the States. Hundreds and hundreds of families showed up when word got out that the Krauses were there to pick 50 children. Dr. Schless, as a pediatrician, helped considerably during this process. Among other things, he was looking for children who, in his opinion, would be certainly physically able to withstand the journey, emotionally prepared to the extent that a child as young as 5 could possibly be emotionally prepared to leave their parents for an unknown, strange land. One of the children who I interviewed when I was working on my film and book remembered being administered what he realized decades later was a Rorschach test. He remembered looking at a bunch of strange-looking ink blots. So Dr. Schless was helping there. But it still begs the question of how you could possibly narrow it down to 50. No doubt, hundreds, if not thousands of children were equally qualified and equally capable of this journey. Eleanor, in her memoir, talks about the heartbreaking, just the heartbreaking nature of having to say no to the vast majority of parents who were begging them to take their children, and yet ultimately they had to pick. One thing they did do was there were a number of siblings who were part of this group of 50. Among the 50 children, there were 7 sets of siblings, 2 brothers, 2 sisters, or brother and sister, whatever. So whenever they could, the Krauses tried to keep young children together so they would not be physically separated. But again, ultimately, what a heartbreaking endeavor. They did not travel on an airplane. They sailed back on a ship. The journey took a couple of weeks, about 10 days at sea. Needless to say, I don't think any of the children had ever experienced an ordeal like that. And I'll add one other word, because the question often comes up as well: what happened to the children once they got here? This Brit Shalom organization that I've mentioned a couple of times, this fraternal organization that Gil was a part of, that helped to fund and sort of organize this whole thing, they had opened up a summer camp outside of Philadelphia a few years earlier for the children of their members. And there was kind of a dormitory at that summer camp. And there were about 25 bedrooms, which is one of the reasons why Gil sort of came up with the number 50. It was a nice round number. The children spent the summer of 1939 at that summer camp. And all during that summer, the Krauses and others worked to find relatives. Some of these children, some of these families did have relatives, cousins, aunts, uncles, what have you, living in the United States. And so a lot of these children then were sent to live with their relatives. Some lived temporarily with foster families for a while. 2 of the children lived with the Krauses for a couple of years, went to the same Quaker schools that the Kraus children went to. And perhaps one of the most amazing things about this story, which continues to shock me even to this day, is that among the 50 children, most of them were reunited with one or both parents, ultimately. Somewhat miraculously, most of the parents themselves survived the Holocaust. Some were able to get visas to the United States quite soon after their children. Others took a number of years. Some of the children lost at least one parent in the Holocaust. But in all the research we did on the 50 children, I didn't come across a single one of those 50 children who lost both of their parents in the Holocaust, which is a miracle. Any other questions? Did I answer everything I could possibly answer about this amazing story? There's a gentleman there.
I was wondering if quite a few of these children are, well, of course, they're adults now. Are most of them still alive, and were you able to interview? You know, I was born in '39,
yes.
So it's about that time.
Right. A good question, sir. Thank you for asking that. What happened to the children? Are they still alive? You know, I still call them children. They'll always be children to me because as I was working on this project, I was collecting a number of photographs of them as children. The youngest was 5, the oldest was about 14. And then, of course, I had the great privilege and honor of meeting a number of them when I was working on the film. When I first started out on this project, and again, now my work on this project goes back about 10 years. So when I first started working on this project, I discovered probably half of them were still alive, which I thought was pretty good. And so I quickly tried to get in touch with as many of them as I could because, well, to put it bluntly, time was running out. And I've stayed in touch with a number of them. So in my film, there are 8 or 9 of them that I interviewed for the film. I ended up meeting face-to-face close to 20 of the 50. And I've stayed in touch with a number of them. Given their advanced age, over the last 10 years, a number of them have passed away. The folks at the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. have also continued to stay in touch and collect materials for the museum from a number of these families. And the last time we checked, there are somewhere between 6 and 8 of the 50 who we believe are still with us. I'm very pleased to say that in a couple of weeks, I'm doing an online Zoom discussion about this story with one of the 50, a lovely guy named Paul Beller who lives in New Jersey, who's in the film. Paul was about 8 years old when he was rescued, so I believe he was born in 1931. So we can all do the math. These folks are getting up there in age, but there's still a few of them with us. You know, it's funny, we'll get to your question in just a second. You know, one of the other questions that I'm sometimes asked is, well, how did you find these people after all these years? And I like to tell people that before I turned my attention to filmmaking, I mentioned earlier, I had been a journalist for a number of years, and I did a little bit of investigative kind of journalistic work that involves digging. And I employed all those skills that I had as a journalist and simply started typing names into Google. It's just, well, it continues to amaze me the kinds of things you can find out by simply typing someone's name into Google. And a number of them, it was a little more difficult with the women because most of the women's names had changed by virtue of getting married or whatever. I had their original German names. Some of them had been anglicized, both first and last names. But ultimately, I was successful in finding a number of them. Yes, ma'am.
Is your documentary available to purchase?
And
also your book?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for asking that. The documentary can easily be accessed on Amazon Prime Video. The documentary initially was on HBO. It's still on the HBO streaming service, but it's also available to rent and stream on Amazon Prime. The book is available in all the usual places, Amazon, wherever you go for your books. The book is definitely available. Oh, I'm sorry. No, I don't think so. Although I'm sure you can find the book in the library.
Yes, we do indeed have
Excellent.
it at the Amarillo Public Library.
Yeah. Anything else? Yes, sir. Yeah.
In carrying out this project, excuse me, who was the greatest facilitator or gave you the assistance and the support that you needed to do this work?
That's an excellent question. Who sort of helped to facilitate? This was an interesting effort by Gil Kraus. Gil knew next to nothing about our immigration law. He was a business lawyer in Philadelphia, so he was taking on something that he knew nothing about. Gil got very lucky because when he went to the State Department to talk about this amongst folks at the State Department, he was fortunate enough to meet a gentleman named George Messersmith. George Messersmith in 1939 was an assistant secretary of state who was involved in some internal affairs at the State Department. But more significantly, Mr. Messersmith had been the consul general at the American Embassy in Berlin during the 1930s and was intimately familiar with what was happening to Jews in Germany going back to when Adolf Hitler first became chancellor in 1933. And George Messersmith, unfortunately, unlike a number of his other colleagues at the State Department, was quite sympathetic toward the plight of Jews, and particularly the increasing numbers of Jewish refugees who were desperately trying to come both here and to any other country that would have them, as opposed to a number of other very high-ranking officials at the State Department at that time that were doing just the opposite, basically doing everything they could to keep Jews and other refugees out of the United States. So Gil, fortunately, had a sympathetic ear with George Messersmith. George Messersmith could offer no official sort of sanction, official support of the State Department. This was something that the State Department was going to sort of stay hands-off with. But kind of on the sly, George Messersmith started sending cables to a good friend of his, Raymond Geist, who was still stationed in Berlin at our embassy in Berlin. We still had an embassy, of course, because we were not yet at war with Nazi Germany. And the combination of Messersmith and Geist provided the formula that allowed Gil Kraus to convince the diplomatic folks, first in Vienna and then in Berlin, to set aside these visas that were then handed over to the children. The sort of secret that Gil ultimately discovered that allowed him to get a hold of these very precious visas, which were worth their weight in gold, was that under the quota system that still existed at that time with our immigration laws, visas would be issued for countries like Germany and Austria and elsewhere. But if for some reason whoever got those visas decided not to go, either they became sick or they somehow lost the ability to travel, or they somehow ended up going elsewhere, those visas weren't just automatically handed over to somebody else. They expired. And again, because of the attitudes that prevailed within our own State Department, it's not as if they turned around and said, hey, let's find some other people. Gil discovered these so-called unused visas that were simply going to expire. And he, to his everlasting credit, convinced the diplomatic folks, both in our diplomatic folks in both Vienna and Berlin, to, rather than sort of send them off to the dead letter pile, set them aside for these 50 children. And that's how he was able to hand over the visas that allowed these children to come to the United States. So I don't really talk too much about Messersmith and Geist in the film. The book, not too surprisingly, goes into a considerably more detail about that. By the way, both Messersmith and Geist also have pretty prominent roles in a fabulous book that was written some years ago by Eric Larson called In the Garden of Beasts, which is about our then ambassador to Germany during this period, Mr. Dodd, and his somewhat colorful daughter, and some of the escapades that she was up to in Germany during the 1930s. And both Messersmith and Geist played prominent roles in that book as well. So I would recommend that as well. Very good. Well, I want to thank, oh, maybe one more? I'm sorry, I'm going to put Cynthia. The question is, did all of the children stay in the United States? It's a very good question. I know of two for sure who did not stay in the United States. One of them I ended up interviewing for my film, a guy named Kurt Admon. Kurt had an interesting story because Kurt was one of the older children, so he was about 12 or 13 when he came to the United States. He lived with some relatives for a while, and by the time the war ended in 1945, and then a couple of years after, Kurt was determined to wind up in what became the State of Israel, and ended up sort of sneaking into what was then still Palestine, and lived the rest of his life in Israel. And it was quite something for me to meet and interview him in the community of Netanya, Israel, which is a little bit north of Tel Aviv. Kurt passed away a couple of years ago, but I stayed in touch with him for the longest time. And there was only one other of the children who I never met. I really wanted to meet this guy because he had a little bit of a dubious record, literally a record. He did some time in a German prison sometime in the 1960s, I believe, for some financial shenanigans. But he was a colorful character as best as I could tell. And I think at some point he had moved back to Germany. He may have wound up at the very end of his life back in the States, and unfortunately, I was never able to get a hold of him before he passed away. Thank you very much. You've been a wonderful audience. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve, for an amazing presentation.